What if I told you that once upon a time there was a dude that led a group of survivalists, frontiersmen that grabbed their hunting rifles and fought against the British to ultimately win our independence? And that dude, at one point, was sentenced to 500 lashes from a British officer because he knocked him unconscious. But then sometime after that, actually just about 20 years exactly after that, he was shot in the face. And the ball came out the back of his neck, and it took a bunch of teeth with him. And he survived that too. And then he survived captivity in British prisons. He would go on to lead in battles like the Saratoga campaign, Bemis Heights, and the assault on Bremen's Redoubt. He would win a day at the Battle of Cowpens against the British. These are the origin stories that the show American Marksman is all about. This is the story of Morgan's rifles. You see, in 1775, the Continental Congress authorized the formation of 10 expert rifle companies. That was a response to what is effectively British gun control and the attempted removal of colonist weapons, which ultimately resulted in the battles at Lexington and Concord. Those 10 rifle companies were going to be comprised of 2 from Maryland, 2 from Virginia, and 6 from Pennsylvania. We're going to talk about just one of those right now out of Virginia. They're actually mustered 35 miles from me in Winchester, Virginia, and I think that's super neat. Anyway, 80 enlisted men and 16 officers mustered out of Winchester, Virginia to take the trek 600 miles north to support General Washington at the Siege of Boston. They were led by Daniel Morgan. Daniel Morgan is a hell of a dude to talk about. His story is one that's fresh out of legends. Morgan's Rifles was initially just a company. That company of men was hand-selected by Morgan from people in and around the Shenandoah Valley. Eventually it would grow though. It would grow into what we now know as the Provisional Rifle Corps. The Provisional Rifle Corps was a specialized unit of infantry. Their primary purpose was scouting missions. General Washington described them as somewhat of a counter to Native American tactics. Essentially, they carried some of the same tools, hatchets, they wore hunting shirts. Their long rifles were probably better suited, at least at the time, for hunting game. But what Morgan and his rifles found was those same rifles that they could use to hunt game, which are extremely accurate and precise out to and including 250 yards, could very much so be taken to take other game. Remember, the only difference between taking a 4-legged animal and a 2-legged animal when it comes to the skills and experience necessary to do so is intent. A lot of those skills are the same. I want to spend a little bit of time on the rifle though. The rifle is what we now know as the long rifle. Other names like the Kentucky long rifle, the Pennsylvania long rifle, we're just going to call it the long rifle. We actually see this iconography all over the place. The United States Army Infantry, for example, used crossed long rifles as their primary insignia. It was a whole lot different from their British counterparts' weapons though. Their British counterparts used what's known as the Brown Bess. It's a smoothbore musket that's got a general accuracy of like minute of barn door at about 50 to 75 yards. Roundabout. The long rifle could be accurate at and beyond 250 yards though. We actually have testimonials from 1775 that discuss the accuracy of the long rifle in the hands of a skilled marksman. An excerpt from the Virginia Gazette discusses one of these exhibitions. Published on September 9, 1775, I quote, "A man held between his knees a board 5 inches wide and 7 inches long with a paper bullseye the size of $1. Riflemen at 60 yards, without a rest, put 8 bullets in succession through the bullseye." From the same source, we're told that the riflemen gave an exhibition, quote, "in which a company, in a quick advance, placed their shots in 7-inch targets at 250 yards. I'm gonna be honest. I'm not putting a 5x7 board between my legs now and letting anybody shoot that. Much less in 1775. Taking things a step further, when you think about the accuracy and efficacy of the smoothbore at just 50 to 75 yards, to see an entire company get online and engage head-sized targets at 250 yards, that would have been a sight, man. The American long rifle was adapted out of Jaeger rifles. These were German immigrants that had knowledge and experience of the technology carried and used by Jaeger light infantry, Hessians. We're going to come back to the Germans here in a second. The difference between the American long rifle and the Jaeger rifle, though, was, essentially, the long rifle was made for function, not for form. A lot of the Jaeger rifle examples that we have left over have beautiful engraving all over them. You can tell that these are works of art. A lot of the American long rifles that we have left over look like your granddad's hunting rifle. because that's exactly what they were. The American long rifle used quite a bit smaller of a caliber as well, and with that longer barrel, it punched that caliber out of there at a much higher rate of speed. That gave the American long rifle even more distance than the Jaeger rifle, the Jaeger rifle also being a rifled barrel. That's going to matter very much here in a minute when we start to talk about the Battle of Bemis Heights and the charge at Bremen's Redoubt. One thing's for certain though, these guys understood every facet about their rifle. They understood their capabilities with it, they understood the rifle's capabilities, and they understood how they intersect, and then how they interface with other elements like Mother Nature, wind, moisture. Things that would impact the ballistic capabilities of the rifle and their capabilities as a shooter to operate the rifle. Some of those same principles that Morgan's rifles would have applied are those that are still on display at competitions like KRG's Extreme Long Range competition. The balance between the load, the shooter, the gun, and how each of those things interfaces with Mother Nature. The American long rifle wasn't perfect though. When it comes to traditional weapons of the time, especially for your mainline infantry force, it had a couple key things that were missing or that just didn't work out so well. One of those things was a bayonet. When Morgan's rifles would get into close combat, the hatchets came out and they flipped those rifles over and turned them into what is essentially a club. They baseball clubbed the shit out of people with them. There's even paintings of that and whatnot. Like it's nutty, man. But they were faster to foul as well. Because of the tighter tolerances inside of that barrel, due to the rifling, black powder was extremely nasty and would foul the barrel much, much faster. The load times were already slow because of those tighter tolerances, but because of the increased fouling, it made it even slower. The goal at the time, when standing in those stupid lines across from each other, was to get off as many volleys as possible before everybody closed ranks and you charged each other with the pointy end. Morgan's rifles were not a great mainline infantry force. That's why they were employed as scouts though, and General Washington himself described them as a great counter to the tactics employed by the Native Americans. Those Native Americans whom were being used as allies by the British. Daniel Morgan is one of those personalities from history that's kind of a tall tale, but all sources combined, he was actually a pretty wild dude. He was born in somewhere around 1736 in Jersey. When he was a teen, he moved down to the Shenandoah Valley, became a farmer, and by the time the French and Indian War came about, he served as a teamster, which meant he drove a wagon and carried supplies and wounded to and from the battlefield. Now in 1755, British loyalists at the time, the British military, didn't really consider men like Daniel Morgan to be gentlemanly. These are wild guys, man. These are the equivalent of blue-collar workers that you have today. They like to drink, they like to fight, and they had a mouth. One of these British officers decided that he was going to teach Daniel Morgan a lesson by hitting him with the flat side of his sword. That was dumb, because Daniel Morgan then knocked that dude out. Now because of that, Morgan was sentenced to 500 lashes. 500 lashes at the time was a death sentence, but he survived it. Morgan would later joke that the drummer only counted 499 times, and because he only counted 499 lashes, he survived. That took place in 1755 during the heat of the French and Indian War. He'd never forget it though. By the time Morgan's rifles mustered out of Winchester, Virginia and marched their way up to Boston, he was ready for a little bit of payback. Towards the end of 1775, Morgan was assigned to General Benedict Arnold. Yes, that one. This is before he turned into an asshole. You see, they were going to raid into Quebec. The raid itself, actually the expedition into Quebec, was kind of a disaster. They had terrible intelligence and ended up losing a ton of dudes. By the time they got to Quebec City, they were already an anemic force in comparison to what they were when they left. But Morgan and his rifles were nonetheless some of the first to assault the lower city. It's during that assault on December 31st, 1775, that Morgan got shot in the face. They shot this man in the face and the ball came out the back of his neck. It took a bunch of teeth with it, and he continued to fight, at least for a short time. The way the story goes, he was incapacitated at some point, and that ultimately is one of the catalysts that led to his capture. He'd then spend a couple years in prison. But that's where we pick back up, after Morgan got out of prison in a prisoner exchange. During the battles of Saratoga, Morgan and his rifles, specifically at the Battle of Bemis Heights, would hold the American left against the British right. Bemis Heights was a battle for a series of bluffs near what is now Stillwater, New York. That British right primarily consisted of Hessian mercenaries. Hessian mercenaries that included Jaeger light infantry and their Jaeger rifles. There were also 3-pounder and 6-pounder guns that covered the approaches to some of the redoubts and defenses that they had in place, defending against the American lines. Morgan and his men on the American left really spent the entirety of their time picking off officers and those artillerymen, ultimately in the hopes that it would demoralize troops and it would remove artillery's capability to cover the advance if there is a charge. At one point in time, at least the way the story goes, one of Morgan's men, a man by the name of Timothy Murphy, climbed up a tree, fired 2 rounds across the field, and ended up shooting General Simon Fraser in the stomach. General Fraser falling in the middle of the battle was a massive morale loss to the British. Sources from the time describe Timothy's rifle as a double-barreled rifle, both barrels rifle, and it costed about 20 Spanish dollars. There's a little bit of controversy in some circles around whether or not Timothy Murphy was the one that actually took that shot. The way another story goes is that just some old dude with his hunting rifle, which is just about every rifle that was owned by Morgan's Rifles, just happened to see a bunch of pretentious officers hopping around on horseback, took a shot, and put him down. One thing is absolutely certain though. There is an overwhelming likelihood that a marksman with a solid understanding of his capabilities behind his rifle put the shot on General Fraser that took him out of the fight, ultimately leading to the morale loss that would eventually lead to the collapse of the British lines. Once those lines started to collapse, again, with Morgan and his riflemen covering the left against the British right and the Hessians and the Jaegers and that artillery, well, Morgan and his riflemen had set conditions for that advance. As the Americans advanced against the British right, the Hessian forces covering Bremen's redoubt started to collapse, and it turned into a rout. The way this story goes, Colonel von Bremen, the Hessian commander, saw his men in a rout, essentially started attacking his men with his sword, and then they killed him for it. I'm gonna be honest, man. It's probably the hats. They probably routed because of these stupid hats. It's drip or drown, and you can't look stupid in your gear. That's the #1 rule. This dude is swinging a hatchet at this guy who looks absolutely terrified. The hats are not it, man. The success of the Saratoga campaign, including the assault on Bremen's redoubt, as well as the battle at Bemis Heights, is considered now to be one of the catalysts that brought the French to the table with more material support than previously. Ultimately, a major contributor to American success and the war for our independence. Depending upon how you look at it, you can almost tie that back to the shot that took out General Simon Fraser. If sources are to be believed, that shot and the loss of General Fraser resulted in such a morale boost that it directly led to the rout that took place after. The legacy of Morgan's Rifles goes well beyond just the military, in my opinion. Organizations like the 75th Ranger Regiment call back to Morgan's Rifles as their origin story, but I think they're bigger than that. I think that's the origin of the true American marksman. And what is the American marksman? Well, it's anybody. It could be a hunter, a precision shooter in competition, a sniper, somebody in their backyard with an air gun, just working on training for the next time they get to go out to the long range. Morgan's Rifles were the first of us that really gave a shit about how to shoot our rifles that needed to be called in the defense of our nation. Those same skills that they employed to put food on the table and taking game with their rifle were the ones that they employed against the British, whether at Bemis Heights, the Battle of Cowpens, or anywhere else. I see a direct line from Morgan's Rifles to the same competitors that you'll meet out at any precision rifle or two-gun match. These are people that understand that their rifle isn't necessarily for any one purpose when it comes to the disciplines of shooting, long range, CQB stuff, clay pigeon shooting. But there are a multitude of reasons to use, and to understand your capabilities with a rifle. Those same gunsmiths and riflesmiths and people that were putting together these long rifles for which people's livelihoods depended on, I see echoes of those in some of the manufacturers that we have today. Some of those are sitting here in front of me. They're continuing to innovate and provide lighter, more accurate, more capable rifles to hunters, snipers, and everyday shooters that want to maximize their capabilities with their rifle. In these niche circles, those principles still live on, but in my opinion, the culture of American marksmanship is erring on the side of being lost to time. At one point in time, it was more than just something that you did on the weekends. It was what you needed to do to survive, to put food on the table, to defend your home, to offend a tyrant. I think we've also forgotten what firearms are for in the first place. They are absolutely intended to be weapons that take a life, whether that be a two-legged life or a four-legged life. The difference between those two things from a skills and equipment perspective is nothing but intent. At one point in time, we forgot that. You became an extremist for saying things like, I will be prepared to use my firearm to defend myself and my family from any threat, whether it be in my home or from my government. That was common discourse in Daniel Morgan's time, in the name and fallacy of pacification being the norm, rather than the violence and the preparation for it being the historical truth. I feel as though as a culture we've lost sight of what marksmanship means to us as a nation. Every episode of American Marksman is hopefully going to revive a little bit of that culture. I can't get them hats out of my head. I mean, no wonder they routed, dude. God, y'all look dumb. They look dumb. Thank you for watching this episode of American Marksman. Make sure to watch the full Pepperbox TV exclusive, where I'm going to break down every aspect to this rifle, take you to an extreme long-range competition with some of my friends like KRG, Thunder Beast, Burris, Proof Research, and I'm also going to take you through one of their manufacturing processes as well. Go be great.